Have you ever felt a presence lurking just out of sight, watching you from the shadows? Imagine a nightmare that refuses to end, a terror that follows you from the dark corners of your own home to the deepest recesses of your mind. Tonight, I want to share with you a story that defies all reason, a chilling tale that blurs the line between sanity and madness. It begins with a murder case that haunted my early career, a case involving a cannibalistic serial killer whose confessions made even the most seasoned detectives shudder. But what made this case truly horrifying wasn't just the gruesome details of his crimes. It was the name that kept coming up, Alice. Alice wasn't just another victim, she was the killer's most macabre trophy. He claimed to have cooked and eaten her, yet her name continued to appear in the most impossible places. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Alice's story wasn't over, it had only just begun. From the moment we arrested the killer, a series of inexplicable events began to unfold. The line between reality and nightmare blurred as I was drawn into a chilling web of supernatural terror. And now, as I sit here recounting these events, I can't shake the feeling that Alice is still out there, watching, waiting. Stick with me until the end, because this is not just another horror story. It's a descent into a darkness that defies explanation, a journey into the heart of fear itself. Are you ready to confront the truth? Or will you be left haunted by what you hear? Brace yourself. The horror is just beginning. Subscribe now and join our community of horror enthusiasts. Hit that notification bell so you're the first to know when a new story drops. Get ready for more real-life horrors, eerie mysteries, and the most disturbing tales you won't hear anywhere else. There are some cases that never leave you. Even after 30 years of staring into the eyes of murderers and killers, of listening to their twisted confessions, there's one case that still crawls beneath my skin. It was the first real case I worked as a rookie detective, and no matter how hard I've tried to forget it, the memories come back like a flood every time I close my eyes. But when I heard the news that he had died, the man from that interrogation, it all came rushing back, clearer than ever before. I was barely into my second year on the force when they paired me with Detective Harris, a grizzled veteran who'd seen more than his fair share of the darkness this city holds. The assignment was to assist on a case, but no one prepared me for what I was about to encounter. Routine, they said. I'll never forget that word, because nothing about this case was routine. I was about to sit across from a man who had done things that no human mind should be capable of conceiving. It was my first time in the interrogation room for something this big. The air was thick with that sterile, artificial coldness that makes you uncomfortable no matter how many times you've been in there. I sat across from him, the man who, just days before, had been discovered in his grim little apartment, surrounded by horrors I couldn't even begin to imagine at the time. His wrists were shackled to the table, the cuffs clinking slightly as he adjusted himself in the chair, as if trying to get comfortable for a casual chat. But his eyes, I'll never forget his eyes. They were distant, like he wasn't really there. Hollow, as if something had scooped out whatever humanity might have once lived inside him. He looked through me, not at me, with a calmness that sent a shiver down my spine. I was young, inexperienced, and I could feel it. I wasn't prepared for what came next. When he spoke, his voice was unnervingly soft. He began recounting his crimes as though he were reading a recipe. Methodical. Precise. There was no emotion behind his words, just a strange, detached logic. He described how he stalked his victims, always choosing them carefully. He wanted someone chubby, he said, with a tone that made it sound like he was picking out fresh produce. Those were the best ingredients, according to him. He watched them for days, sometimes weeks, learning their routines, their habits. He liked to strike at night when the world was quiet. He paused for a moment, looking down at his hands as if lost in thought. Then, he told me how he killed them. He said it so casually, like it was just part of the process. Strangling, stabbing, it didn't matter. As long as the end result was the same. But the killing wasn't the worst part. No, that came afterward. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping lower as he described how he dragged their bodies back to his apartment. He had 3 fridges, he told me. Large ones. One for food, one for drinks, and one for the victims. The best ones, he said, were kept in their own special fridge. The tastiest ones, he added, as if this was supposed to make sense to me. I felt a sick churn in my stomach as he explained how he used their bodies for special meals. He was meticulous, treating his victims like prized cuts of meat, breaking them down with a precision that felt disturbingly clinical. And then there was the heads. He didn't just kill them. He didn't just eat them. He kept parts of them, trophies, he called them. Their heads, in particular, were valuable to him. He had a small collection in his apartment when they found him. It was hard to believe this man had been living among us, blending in like anyone else, while this atrocity was happening behind closed doors. But what truly unsettled me, even more than the gruesome details of his crimes, was when he started talking about Alice. At first, I thought Alice was just another victim. But the way he spoke about her, it was different. His tone changed. He said they had worked together. She was his partner, his friend, and they hunted for ingredients together. I remember glancing at Harris at that point, and even he looked shaken. The killer spoke about Alice with a strange mix of reverence and regret. He claimed they had a falling out. A disagreement over how to handle one of their hunts. And that's when he killed her. But unlike the others, he didn't just kill Alice. No, he said he cooked her, just like the rest of his victims, and ate her. He paused again, smiling faintly as if remembering some fond memory, before explaining that he kept her head as a token of their friendship. But it was the next part that still makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. He told me, in that same calm voice, that Alice was still with him. That on the night he was arrested, she had been sitting at his dining table. He described how he walked into the room and saw her there, smiling at him, surrounded by plates of food he had prepared from other victims. He was terrified. He said he ran to the fridge where he had kept her head, and it was still there, just like it had been. In a panic, he grabbed a knife and stabbed her, over and over again. But no matter how many times he did it, she wouldn't die. She just stood up, smiled, and said goodbye before disappearing. Even as I sat there, I could feel my pulse quickening. This man was insane, but there was something in his voice, something in his eyes, that made me question everything. He didn't look delusional. He looked certain. Like he believed every word. After he told me about Alice, I didn't know what to think. My mind was racing, trying to process the grotesque details he'd shared. I had interrogated suspects before, but none like him. I could feel the cold sweat starting to gather on the back of my neck. The way he talked about her, it wasn't just another victim in his twisted gallery of horrors. It was something else. Something worse. He didn't stop talking about Alice after that. In fact, it was as if the more he spoke about her, the more animated he became. His dead, hollow eyes seemed to flicker to life, but not in a way that was comforting. No. It was as if he was reliving something terrifying, even to him. "She's out there," he whispered, his voice dropping so low I had to lean in to hear. "I can still feel her. She's watching me. You think she's gone, but she's not." He stared directly into my eyes, and for the first time since I sat down across from him, I felt an overwhelming chill. The room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. My breath caught in my throat, but I forced myself to remain calm, to maintain control. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Alice is dead. You said it yourself. You killed her." He smiled. A slow, sickening smile that twisted across his face in a way that made my skin crawl. "Oh, I killed her. I killed her good. Cooked her, too. She tasted," he paused, his eyes drifting toward the ceiling as if savoring the memory. "Like nothing I've ever had before. Perfect. But death doesn't stop her." I remember shifting uncomfortably in my seat. I glanced over at Harris, hoping for some sign that we should push the conversation in another direction, but he was silent, his face as hard as stone. He wanted to hear more, and so did I, no matter how unsettling it was. "She was sitting at the table that night," he continued, his voice taking on a distant, almost dreamlike quality. "I thought I'd lost my mind. I had her head. It was right there, in the fridge. But she was right in front of me. Smiling. She looked the same as she did the day I killed her, but her eyes, those eyes. They were different. Black. Empty." He stopped and stared at the table for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't bring myself to speak. I was too afraid of what he might say next. "I ran to the fridge," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I opened it, and there it was. Her head. Cold. Lifeless. But she was still sitting there. I grabbed the knife, the sharpest one I had. I stabbed her over and over again. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She just kept smiling. I stabbed her until there was nothing left but blood. But even then, she didn't go away." I felt a knot form in my stomach as he said those last words. The way he described it, it was as if Alice had become something more than just a figment of his guilt-ridden imagination. It was as if she had transcended death, haunting him in a way that went beyond what I could rationally explain. But what made it worse, far worse, was the fear in his eyes when he spoke about her. "She said goodbye," he whispered, his voice cracking. "She stood up, looked me in the eye, and said goodbye. Then, she disappeared. Just like that. But I know she's still out there. I can feel her." At that moment, I felt a creeping sense of dread that I couldn't shake. The kind of fear that wraps around your throat and squeezes, making it hard to breathe. He wasn't lying. At least, he didn't believe he was. And that was the part that scared me most. I tried to push through it, forcing myself to ask the logical questions. But Alice, she's dead. She died 10 years ago in a car accident. We looked into it. She was cremated. There's no way she could be here. She's gone. The room fell into a heavy silence. He didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, he leaned in, his face inches from mine, his breath cold on my skin. "That's what they want you to think," he said, his voice barely more than a rasp. "But I saw her. I know what I saw. You can't kill her, she's not done yet. Not with me. Not with any of us." I didn't know how to respond. My heart was racing, pounding in my chest as if trying to escape. The rational part of my brain was telling me that he was crazy, that this was all a delusion, a manifestation of his fractured mind. But the other part of me, the part that had seen too much, that had stood in that blood-soaked apartment and felt the weight of something far darker than just a man with a twisted appetite, wasn't so sure. The interview ended shortly after that, but his words stayed with me. As we walked out of the room, I glanced back at him one last time. His eyes were locked on me, unblinking, as if he could see something I couldn't. Something lurking just behind me. I still see his face in my dreams sometimes. And every time I do, I can hear him whispering the same words, over and over again. "She's not done yet." The next few days after the interrogation were heavy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. That sickening smile, those hollow eyes, and the way his voice cracked when he whispered about Alice. I'd been through tough cases before, but this was different. It gnawed at me, buried itself deep under my skin like a parasite. No matter how much I tried to reason with myself, to convince myself that he was just a delusional killer, making up ghost stories to cope with his insanity, something didn't feel right. But things really took a turn when we started digging deeper into Alice. I was still new to the job, so I wasn't leading the investigation, but I was in the thick of it. Harris had been quiet since the interrogation. He didn't say much about what we heard in that room, but I could tell it rattled him. There was something in the way he avoided my eyes whenever I asked about Alice, as if he didn't want to acknowledge what was happening, like admitting it would make it real. We spent hours combing through files, trying to piece together the history of Alice. We found her record, everything the killer said lined up. Alice had died in a car accident 10 years ago. Cremated. No doubt about it. But here's the thing, her name kept coming up in places it shouldn't have. A police report from 3 years ago, where a witness claimed they saw her at a bus stop in the middle of the night. Another report from 5 years ago, where someone swore she had knocked on their door asking for directions. Each report had been dismissed, probably assumed to be mistaken identity, or just people seeing things. But now, after everything we had heard, I wasn't so sure. I didn't want to admit it, but the more I read, the more I felt like we were missing something big, something terrifying. It wasn't just the killer's delusions. These sightings, these reports, it was as if Alice hadn't really left. Like she was still out there, wandering through the lives of strangers. And for some reason, she had come back into his. Then there was the blood. The forensic team had found a large pool of blood in the killer's apartment, right where he said Alice had been sitting. At first, I thought it would be from one of the victims, some poor soul he had butchered and served up like dinner. But the lab results came back, and that's when things got strange. The blood didn't belong to any of the known victims. It was Alice's. Her DNA was there, in that pool of blood. The same Alice who had died a decade earlier. The same Alice who had supposedly been cremated. I remember staring at the report, my mind spinning in disbelief. It wasn't possible. How could someone who had been dead for years leave behind fresh blood at a crime scene? Every logical explanation crumbled in front of me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the killer had found some way to get her blood before she died. Maybe it was planted. But how? Why? None of it made sense. The walls of reality were starting to crack, and I could feel the dread sinking deeper into my bones. We questioned the lab, ran the tests again, but it all came back the same. That blood was hers. And there was no way to explain it. I wanted to dismiss it, to shove the reports aside and forget about Alice. But every time I did, I'd remember the way the killer spoke about her, the way his voice dropped to a whisper when he said she wasn't done. That she was still out there. Watching. Waiting. It got worse when I started seeing things myself. At first, it was just small things. Flickers in the corner of my vision. A shadow that shouldn't be there, moving in the reflection of a window. The sensation that someone was standing right behind me, breathing softly on the back of my neck, only to turn around and find nothing. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I could have sworn I heard a voice, soft, like a whisper in the dark, saying goodbye. Just like he said Alice had said to him. I sat up in bed, my eyes scanning the dark room, half expecting to see her sitting at the edge of my bed, smiling. I didn't sleep after that. I didn't even try. I started to question everything. Was Alice real? Had she somehow survived the accident, only to slip through the cracks of life and death? Or was she something else entirely, something that couldn't be explained? Something that existed outside of the boundaries of what we understood? I didn't have answers. All I had were more questions, and a growing sense of fear that no matter how hard I tried to shake it, Alice wasn't done with any of us yet. Things started spiraling after the lab confirmed that the blood in the apartment belonged to Alice. My mind was already stretched to the breaking point, but I didn't have time to process it. Not really. The case kept moving forward, and I had to keep up. But with every new detail we uncovered, it felt like the ground beneath me was slipping away. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see her, Alice. Sometimes it was her face, pale and lifeless, other times it was just her silhouette standing in the shadows. Watching. Waiting. And every time, that damn whisper would come back, "Goodbye." It echoed in my mind, soft but persistent, like a gentle breeze carrying the stench of something rotten. Harris noticed. He asked me if I was okay, but I couldn't tell him the truth. How do you explain to your seasoned partner that you're being haunted by a dead woman? I just shrugged it off, told him I was fine, that I just needed some rest. But I could tell he didn't believe me. How could he? I didn't even believe myself. That was when things got worse. We got a call from the precinct about another strange development. Apparently, the killer, the man who had calmly confessed to butchering and eating his victims, had started to unravel. He wasn't just sitting in his cell anymore, waiting for trial. No, he was screaming. Screaming about Alice. About how she was following him, watching him from the corners of his cell, whispering to him, just like she whispered to me in my dreams. The guard said he wouldn't stop. Every night, he'd wake up drenched in sweat, begging for them to take him somewhere else, anywhere else. He'd scream that she was there with him, that she wouldn't let him rest. He said she wanted something. She wanted all of us. We had to go see him again. When Harris and I arrived at the holding facility, the atmosphere was suffocating. I could feel the tension hanging in the air, thick and heavy. The guards looked uneasy, and I couldn't blame them. They weren't used to dealing with something like this. Hell, no one was. We walked down the long, narrow corridor to the interrogation room. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie, inconsistent glow. My heart was pounding in my chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. Harris walked ahead of me, calm and collected as always, but I could see the stiffness in his posture. He was nervous too. The door to the interrogation room creaked as we opened it. The killer was sitting there, shackled to the table again, but this time he looked different. He was pale, gaunt, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were wild, darting around the room as if he was expecting someone, or something, to appear at any moment. "She's here," he whispered the moment we stepped into the room. His voice was hoarse, barely audible, as if he had spent the last few days screaming nonstop. "She's right here. Don't you see her?" I felt my stomach drop. There was no one else in the room, just the three of us, but the way he spoke, the way his eyes were fixed on something over my shoulder. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Harris didn't flinch. He sat down across from the killer, motioning for me to do the same. I hesitated, my legs feeling like lead, but I forced myself to sit down, my eyes flicking to the empty corner of the room where the killer's gaze was locked. "Who's here?" Harris asked, his voice steady, even. "Alice," the killer said, his lips twitching into a manic smile. "She's always here. She's never left. She watches. She waits. She knows what you did." His eyes shifted suddenly, locking onto mine. "She knows you can feel her too." I froze. I couldn't move. My mind was screaming at me to say something, to brush it off, but I couldn't. He was right. I did feel her. I didn't want to admit it, not to Harris, not to anyone. But the truth was gnawing at me from the inside. Alice wasn't just haunting him. She was haunting me too. I forced myself to speak. "What does she want?" My voice sounded distant, like it wasn't my own. The killer's smile widened, a grotesque grin that sent a chill down my spine. "She wants to finish what she started. You think she's done? You think you're safe?" He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed in the small room. "She'll never stop. Not until we're all gone. Every single one of us." Harris leaned in, his expression hardening. "What do you mean? What did she start?" But the killer's attention wasn't on Harris anymore. He was staring straight at me, his eyes wide, his face twisted with fear. "She's coming for you," he whispered. "She's already started. You can hear her, can't you? At night. When you're alone. She's whispering to you, just like she did to me." My blood ran cold. I could barely breathe. He knew. He knew about the whispers. About the voice that had haunted me every night since the interrogation. I felt like the room was closing in on me, the walls pressing down, suffocating me. I wanted to leave. To get as far away from that room, from that man, as possible. But I couldn't move. I was trapped, pinned to my chair by the weight of his words. "She'll never let you go," he continued, his voice softening into that familiar, eerie whisper. "She'll keep coming, night after night. She'll make sure you never forget. You're part of this now." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just stared at him, my heart racing, my skin prickling with the cold realization that everything he said was true. I could feel it. I wasn't just investigating this case anymore. I was part of it. And Alice wasn't going to let me go. Not until she was done. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. I just sat in my car outside the station, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The words from the killer's last whisper replayed over and over in my mind. "She's coming for you." There was no shaking it off this time. The rational part of me, the one that had spent years in law enforcement, learning to see facts and dismiss fear, was shrinking, dissolving under the weight of something darker. Something I couldn't explain. And for the first time in my career, I was afraid to go home. I wasn't afraid of the dark streets, the late-night noises, or the criminals I'd dealt with in the past. No. I was afraid of her. Of Alice. Of what I might see, what I might hear if I walked through my front door and found myself alone again. I sat in the car for hours, staring out the windshield, my breath fogging up the glass. Every time I blinked, I thought I saw movement in the rearview mirror. A shadow, shifting in the back seat. It was never there when I looked directly. But it was there when I wasn't. Finally, as the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, I forced myself to start the car and drive home. The morning sun gave me a brief sense of safety, as if daylight could somehow chase away whatever was creeping up on me. But even as I pulled into my driveway, I could feel it. That gnawing dread. The feeling that something was watching me. I pushed open the front door to my house, and it was quiet. Too quiet. My eyes scanned the dark corners of the living room, half expecting to see her sitting there, in the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the stillness of an empty house. I tried to go about my morning routine, but every little sound made me jump. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, even the ticking of the clock on the wall, it all felt wrong, out of place, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I walked down the hallway to my bedroom, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't want to go in there. The bed felt like a trap. A place where I'd be most vulnerable. But I hadn't slept in days, and my body was screaming for rest. I collapsed onto the mattress, staring up at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I was safe. That this was just stress. That Alice was just a figment of a killer's broken mind. But the more I told myself that, the less I believed it. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. That's when it happened. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway. My eyes snapped open, my body frozen in place. The house was pitch black, the sun had set while I slept. My heart pounded in my chest as the footsteps grew louder, closer. I wanted to get up, to reach for my gun on the nightstand, but I couldn't move. It was like my body was paralyzed, pinned down by an invisible force. I could only lie there, listening, my breath shallow and ragged. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. I lay there, every muscle in my body tense, my eyes locked on the shadowy outline of the door. And then, the door creaked open. I couldn't see anyone. But I could feel her. The air in the room changed, growing colder, heavier. I felt the weight of something standing just beyond the threshold, watching me. Waiting. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my lips cracked, my entire body trembling with terror. And then, I heard it. A whisper. Soft, familiar, dripping with malice. Goodbye. It was Alice. I knew it. I could feel her presence, the same cold dread that had been with me since the interrogation. But now, it was real. She was here, in my house, standing just feet away from me. The whisper hung in the air like smoke, curling around my mind, suffocating me with fear. My eyes darted toward the door, but I couldn't see her. She was there, though. I could feel it in my bones, in the very core of my being. I was no longer alone. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing tighter, the air growing thick with the weight of something otherworldly. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as quickly as it started, the presence was gone. The door swung shut on its own, leaving me alone in the dark. I lay there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no rational explanation. Alice was dead. I knew that. We all knew that. And yet, she was here. In my home. Whispering her sickening farewell just like she had to the killer. By the time I finally gathered the courage to get out of bed, the sun was rising again. My body ached, my mind was a fog of confusion and terror. I stumbled out of my room, half expecting to see her sitting at the kitchen table, smiling that same twisted smile. But the house was empty. For now. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't. I knew Harris would call me, wondering where I was, but I didn't care. There was something far more pressing, far more terrifying, than the case we were supposed to be solving. Alice wasn't done with me. And I knew, deep down, that she was just getting started.